So welcome to the Futureproofing Next webinar, 6 Steps to Get to Next. And thank you for completing the poll if you've had a chance to do that. I'd like to introduce what we'll be doing today and let you know what will happen in today's webinar. First, I'm Andrea Kates, and I'll be joined with my co-founder of the Futureproofing Next group, the Sean Moffitt. And also we have 2 guests with us today. The theme will be Futureproofing Next, the 6 steps to get to next. And the guests that we have today are Roland Harwood, who is from London, and we are welcoming him. He'll be talking about innovation with some very interesting case studies, as well as Denise Lee Yohn, who is an expert in, and we'll be talking a lot about how we apply all of this to culture. And she's a best-selling author and speaker and expert thought leader in fusion. And we'll talk a little bit about how all of this applies to some very important insights that we can all use to take innovation to the bank. I'd also like to acknowledge Jocelyn Butler and Joanne Limkuhl, who are part of our community leadership group, and would like to thank everyone who's submitted some questions in advance, because first of all, it's really interesting that learning more about unmet customer needs is a really top priority for pretty much everyone. I think it's 100% so far. But also we'll be having good time for question and answers at the end of the session. So today, the first part of this is that we'll be talking about a few topics. One is I'll talk with Denise Lee Yohn about the 6 steps themselves so that everyone has a sense of new ways of thinking about innovation and some insights from real case studies and innovation in the wild. Then Sean and Denise will talk a little bit about some hot off the press insights from research, the Futureproofing Next, and some of the research from the broader community. And we welcome everyone who's on today to actually join our community, and we'll talk about that later. Roland will share some insights from his pretty unique thinking about the ways that companies really apply this and some universal opportunities to apply it. And then finally, we'll do some rules of thumb and talk about what's next. So I'd like to welcome Denise Lee Yohn, and we'll start talking right now about what are some of the things that we need to frame the conversation. You know, what are these 6 steps and the 6 opportunities for everyone in the group to start to get to next. So welcome, Denise. Anything else you want to say about your background and your perspective on this topic? And you should probably unmute. Let me see if I can help with that.
I think I'm unmuted now. Is that
there
right?
You go. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was saying that I don't want to talk about myself. I wanted to hear from you because I'm so excited about this framework. Actually, it's, I think, more than a framework. It's almost a roadmap of getting to next. And so I'd like to hear about these 6 steps that you have developed. And if you could just explain each step and then maybe, pause a little bit. I might have some questions as we go along, but let's go ahead and jump right into them.
I think that's great. So there are 6 steps, and they're based on, as we always say, 13,000 teams and 200 projects, which is where Sean and I were both really excited to say what's gone wrong, what's worked, and what are some universal applications for all of these innovation insights. So I think the first one is really when you're trying to take innovation to the bank. A lot of companies are comfortable with things like SWOT analysis and internal strategy. And a lot of times those are informed by just thinking inside the 4 walls. So clearly the first part that you have to think about, especially if you're an existing company or a large company, is what are some of the ways that you need to look inside now and really get everyone on the same page about where we stand. And it's sometimes really hard to get Group A and Group B together to really think about this. So that's the first step is inside now. And then the second step is this notion of what we call integrated forces. And as you know, Denise, because you look a lot at the market, there are so many forces that it can be really overwhelming. And I think one of the things that Sean will talk about in a minute is right now, there are different issues and different opportunities. I've been talking in the last couple of days about artificial intelligence, for instance, and how those tools have come of age, so that even 5 years ago, things weren't possible that are now. So what are the new technologies and the new trends and the new customer insights that are emerging, this notion of learning more about unmet needs, that you can look at as looking at what we call integrated forces?
Right. Well, and if you don't mind, let's stop right there, because what I'm hearing you say is that you need to be looking both inside and kind of the collaboration and integration that you need internally, and kind of what the vision for that is going forward. But then you also need to be looking outside at market forces, at the broader context. And so I'm wondering if you have an example of how these two perspectives really work together to give you clarity.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times, I'll talk about the mobility space where I've been really pretty active, and I know that Roland's going to talk specifically about that. But if we just think about what we're comfortable with, assembly lines and building automobiles, it'll be really hard for us to accommodate this new world of mobility. So how can we allow ourselves to imagine a world where cars might not be the major form of mobility, and it's everything from self-driving vehicles to having a future where biometrics might be really very important in terms of security, how you look at things like drones, last mile. So if you're not looking externally at these integrated forces and informing your level of comfort, which might be an assembly line, developing automobiles, you're going to miss an opportunity to lead in the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Well, thanks. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So let's go ahead and go on to the next couple of steps and the 6 steps to get to next.
Well, I think the next 2 are really helpful because it's been really hard for me to think about a good analogy for the next 2 steps, learn. And it reminds me of the scientific method, where a scientist can look in a petri dish and ask interesting questions, because these next 2 stages are around kind of the scientific method for what you need to learn and how you need to learn. So let's imagine that we'll go back to mobility, that you're thinking, well, we really need to think of a new world. What would it be like to have autonomous vehicles? What would it be like to have biometrics in a different way? What would security look like, et cetera? So I think what's really a new idea here is this marriage between imagining next, there's all kinds of ways to do that, and, understanding what might be, but then informing it. So we call ourselves rational optimists.
I love that phrase.
Right? And if you tweet anything, it's sort of the next level of strategic advantage comes from being rational optimists, that you have to have this incredible imagination for what might be, married with the experiments that prove what is, and make sure that there's healthy balance there, that there's a healthy interplay and a dynamic. And once again, we could talk about this a lot, but it's a big idea, and it's been the major breakthrough for a lot of the teams, is when they have that marriage between the what if thinking, what might be thinking, and also the rational validation of what happens in small experiments. And of course, my background in lean startup, informs that.
Right. And when you talk about like the scientific method, and you just use the word experiment, it kind of makes me think that you do need to be somewhat hypothesis driven. Having a complete blank slate probably is not as directive or not as productive as at least having some hypotheses or ingoing assumptions that you want to either validate or refute. Does that sound right to you?
That's exactly right. And we were just having a debate about this. I have a lot of background in the lean startup movement, and the question as to whether lean startup has a place in large companies for another webinar, another day. But when you get to the point where you have multiple options of what might be, there's probably 500 ideas in your backlog that are all defensible, right? So then it comes down to when you get a small set, that's the place to start some experiments. And you run a lot of horses out of the gate to see which ones have a business model and the validation in terms of product market fit. So at that point, yeah, there's lots of ways to actually run valid experiments and run those a little bit more. And I'll go through the last two rather quickly,
Yes.
just because I know that this could be a whole webinar. But I think that once you understand seeing and learning in this new way, then deciding will be another webinar in itself, because getting inspiration, yesterday I actually heard a speaker say that you're never competing against the last person in your industry. You're competing against the last digital experience in general that your customer has had. So if the customer has just swiped right to pick an Airbnb hotel room, right, then they kind of expect that level of interactivity with your interaction with a heavy manufacturer. And so that's where we can talk another time about inspiration from cross-industry, inspiration from all kinds of places that, once again, a scientific way of bringing inspiration on purpose into your assumptions so that you think big enough. And then the last part, as you know, is once again, we'll run out of time before we run out of conversation on this, but how do you really get people on the same page? To really get leadership into a room where they're able to have what we call here clarity, milestones, metrics, and really be honest about the fact that we are not doing plan A, we're doing plan B. We all have a huge amount of passion and clarity around it. We know what might be based on the impact. And I think that a lot of times, if you don't have that alignment, then you end up going across purposes and undermining potential innovation. So that's my thinking about it.
And Andrea, do you have time just to talk about maybe what are some of the common barriers or hurdles to that implementation that you have found with your clients?
So probably not enough time to talk about all of them, but I think the first thing, quite honestly, is leadership alignment, is really getting into a room and taking the time. I say measure twice, cut once. It's really easy to implement once you're all agreed about what you're trying to accomplish and which of the many options you're going to commit to. And I think that's the hardest thing to do, quite frankly.
Right. So if you had to summarize or kind of leave everyone with one or two thoughts about these 6 steps to get to next, what would that be?
I think the 4 steps that we talk about, the see, the learn, the decide, and commit, to really kind of memorize those, get a tattoo if you need to, and and make sure that your inquiry and your strategy is not informed within your 4 walls.
Mm-hmm.
And
Great.
For another time, we'll keep going, because I know now you want to talk to Shawn about whether he's got some great statistics and feedback from the field that reinforces some of these. So I'll turn it over to Denise and Shawn now to kind of bring that into what's happening in the wild.
Yeah, I really wanted to hear from you, Shawn, because, as I said, I think that this is the 6 steps to get to next is a great roadmap for innovation. But I think that we also know there are a lot of bumps in the road, and Andrea was just kind of starting to talk about them. And you've actually explained to me that there are some common blind spots that companies have to innovation, and I'm hoping that you can kind of take us through some of those.
Yeah, on today's webcast, I'm almost like Andrea's perfectly balanced left brain here. So she's conceptualized these 6 I's, and now I've tried to at least provide some semblance of an argument that says, yeah, you know what, whether it's anecdotally and in this case some evidence, we keep seeing the same blind spots over and over, which has kind of led to our development of these 6 I's. So here's the first one. I mean, I think, I know we're not all Pollyannas about how companies work. Some are good companies, some are bad companies, but I think a lot of times we get in the way of ourselves. And so just trying to get some inside clarity oftentimes is half the battle. And whether it's politics or culture, I find the third one here the most interesting in terms of the inability to act on critical signals in industry developments. Time and time again, I see 12 months, 18 months, 24 months go by before that thing that may put you out of business, people are elevating that to the CEO saying, we should really do something about this. There's a lot of very human-based motivations around that, but I find certainly in larger companies, getting in the way of ourselves is such a bigger issue than what startups maybe have to face.
Yeah, and is it inability or is it unwillingness? You know, I've found in my work that oftentimes if you don't have a burning platform, people just aren't willing to stick their neck out and act. I don't know. Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I oftentimes say people don't care about like the environment until the polar bear shows up in your doorstep, right? And I think it's so true in corporate life. I also think that, you know, I find there's a level of incumbency that if you've been a successful, or at least some modicum of successful business, you've probably done something that was worthy of having that happen. And if you stick with that, that's when you get into trouble. And here's an example of, I know it's easy to dump on big consultancies at time, but Hertz is now suing Accenture for $32 million for a website redesign. So 2 years ago, I think Hertz had this great idea. Well, let's go to one of the big four consultancies and build a website, and it'll be really cool. And I've got this great promise. And it took them 2 years to realize, oh my Lord, it's not responsive. It goes nowhere near the brief. And I don't know about you, Denise, but it's like they had spent $7 million just on the discovery phase, which implies a little bit of we don't really know what we want by virtue of just the size of that budget. So anyway, just an interesting example about how things don't elevate.
Right, right. Okay, so let's talk about this next blind spot, the stimulus blind spot. What is that?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty simple argument here where I think sometimes we cast way too small a net in terms of where our sensates come from and how we might want to innovate. You know, I saw a stat the other day that said the average executive spends 32 hours in either meetings or emails every week. And so you're talking to the same group of people. Not surprisingly, when I look at innovation, and this was a study that was done a couple of years ago, they looked at what the most common innovation inputs were, and people naturally, at least they're asking somebody, but they're asking employees and maybe partners that they work with. What they're not asking is their customers, and they're not asking peer companies, maybe some interesting new development within academia, and certainly not startups. And so you're getting a situation where you're really not in the trenches of innovation. You're kind of just talking to your own self there. We've moved on to the risk here, I guess, so I'll handle this one. I mean, I think the inability to innovate sometimes comes down to something very, very human. Humans don't like to change. You know, there's a certain percentage of us, maybe all of us on this call today want to change, but most of us are afraid or unable to change. It represents kind of a dissonance to our world. And so, you know, half of us say, you know, this is a very high to fairly high factor in terms of preventing companies from attaining growth.
Wow. So, I mean, that's what, like 50% of folks who admit that they, that there's kind of this psychological barrier to change.
I love the fact that you said admit, right? Because sometimes we say, oh, of course we want change. And then we realize, no, you know what? We'd rather have just a different flavor than actually, you know, spending more time. There was an incredible article. I think we pointed the article to the Harvard Business Review thing, but Safi Bakal did a great one and boiled it down to a formula. He actually boiled it down to a very human formula that said, you know what? You know, M was this ability to radically innovate and think out of the box. And he boiled it down to four things. One, you know, what is my incentive for doing this? How big of a management span of control? And he's a big supporter of, you know, big spans of control so people don't get in the way of each other. And what's the level of skill and time versus the politics that I need to manage this? And I found the denominator so interesting here. He said, the higher your salary growth from whatever has brought your business to where it is today, the more challenging it's going to be to actually radically innovate. So if you're getting 20% growth in your salary personally every year, it's really challenging for you to say, oh yeah, and we have to change all of that now, and that may put your salary growth at risk. So I thought it was just a super, super pragmatic way of looking at the human side of innovation.
Yeah, and you know what this speaks to, I think, is what you're going to talk about in this next slide, is that when you work in a startup, you have just like different mentality, and maybe it's because some of these things like a salary you don't have, or maybe it's not growing at a 20% pace. So I'm curious as to what you found is like the differences between the way that startups might approach innovation versus larger enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, beyond the risk appetite and the fact that you probably know the 10 people that have joined the company, you might have been in college together, whatever, there's probably some common bond between you. Really where startups shine is having a process to actually acting quickly. As you see here, it's like, what are the 4 differences between a corporate and a very agile startup environment? You've got a process to iterate. You have technology to support all of that. You have a way to capture that learning and relearn what you're doing. And probably most importantly, at least in my world, I find that startups are really good at sensing and seizing opportunities. They see something, they can act within 2 to 3 weeks on something that a corporation might take 18 months to get at. And so, and I don't want to make this sound easy because, you know, you see some people on stage and it's like, just do the startup approach and companies, corporations, you'll be great. There's a lot of different process and ownership around, you know, getting change amongst 50,000 people than it is 50.
Right, right. And so I think this is the last blind spot, the ambition blind spot.
Yeah, I just think, and I used to work at Procter & Gamble. We were the king of launching singles and doubles, to use baseball parlance. You know, new flavors, kind of new extensions, but not radically changes in business, at least when I worked there in the 90s. And there's some really good research around there to support the fact that where you get the biggest return is through reinventing business models and customer experiences. Unfortunately, where most companies go for is, let's change your product or technology. Some of them get a little bit better and say, well, we've got a service or a process that we want to change. But very few, in this case, I guess less than 20% of them ever get to, let's try to reinvent our business model and customer experience. And then I think this was just, I'll use your own San Francisco Giants. I know both of you are in the Bay Area. Here's a Canadian, Pakistani, Filipino who's actually become the president of operations for San Francisco. And he actually asked all the season ticket holders, if I told you using an opener, so essentially in pitching, there's a starting pitcher and a relief pitcher. Nowadays, all these Moneyball people have said, you know what? We're going to pitch somebody and we're only going to pitch them for an inning to start the game. And he said, look, if we threw 100 years of baseball out the window and say, we could make you win better if you started this person called an opener, not a starter anymore, would you do it? And most of the season ticket holders booed him. So that just gives you a real life sense of just how much we resist this, how much in large companies and in companies that have a lot of tradition, people really resist it.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in now. And first of all, that was really interesting because we always love to sites, and we'll get into a conversation with Roland in a second. Couple of things. One is, thanks for responding to the poll. I'll jump in and tell everyone what the poll results were and what we think about that. And then I'm saved a couple of questions to throw to Roland from the chat that's been coming in. So first of all, I think it's amazing that there's a 50-50 split and nothing having to do with trends. So 50% of us think that one of the biggest challenges, and we always call it innovation you can take to the bank, you know, the business value. 50% think it's around developing ideas you already have. 0% say being responsive to trends, which I know just means that it's not as important as these others. And the other 50% is really interesting, integrating technology into the strategy more. And once again, this is near and dear to all of our hearts because we specialize in digitalization and digital transformation and artificial intelligence and other technologies that are enabling people to leapfrog. So super exciting about that. I'd like to now talk about Roland, who is a thought leader based in London. We actually have lots of time zones going on today. And Roland, one of the things I think is interesting, not only do you look at open innovation and some of the ways that the public and this broader outside of the four walls is magnified, but you also have a lot of really great case studies that we'd like to hear you talk about today. So first of all, tell us what we haven't said about you yet, what your perspective is on what you've heard because you're so good on your feet, and a little bit about this notion of liminal and how it relates to the 6 steps that we've been discussing.
Sure, thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Welcome from London. There's so much that's been discussed already that I'd like to respond to, so I'm not going to do it justice, but just a few things that have jumped out at me so far. one, I love this idea, Andrea. You talk about rational optimists. I was kind of thinking of the inverse of that, irrational pessimists. I definitely think of myself as an optimist. Not sure how rational I am, even though I have a PhD in physics. I tend to trust my gut more and more in the work that I do and the work around me. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. The discussion that you were having, Denise, with Shawn around the different ways to get to next. Something that somebody said to me recently, which I really like, is push what moves. So just push lots of different things. If stuff isn't moving, don't focus on that. Focus on the stuff where you see movement. So it's this kind of idea of agile, lean. And that was just a little thing which just stuck in my mind. And the final thing, Shawn, you admitted that lots of people don't like change, and I too don't like change, which is why I forced myself to leave a successful company that I founded just recently called 100% Open, which was working in 25 different countries, focusing on open innovation, which was brilliant and the best thing I've ever done. But despite that, I felt that the world has changed. It's become incredibly connected. There are great opportunities out there, but there are also great dangers and risks. And so I've set up a new venture called Liminal, which is really about trying to navigate that boundary between great opportunity of connection and also the risks and dangers of it. So I just had 3 kind of case studies I was just going to touch on. Shall I move on to those, Andrea?
Sure. I love your quote, which once again, if people want to tweet, this notion that, as you quote, the periphery is where the future reveals itself. Talk us through that as a physicist, philosopher, and business guy.
So I don't know if people are familiar with the author J.G. Ballard, famous British author. Escapes me what he's most famous for having written, but I just like this quote because in my experience of working with some of the companies I'm going to talk about, Lego, UBS, Ford, and many others, the most interesting stuff, the most interesting ideas, the most interesting people often come from the boundaries or the fringes of places and organizations, the places where you least expect. And so what I'm doing with my new venture is trying to build that peripheral vision, if you will, that organizations have and people have to spot those opportunities appearing maybe outside of your sector or even outside of your geography, which is perhaps why I'm the token non-North American on this session.
Well, and also we in the Futureproofing Next philosophy is so aligned with that because we're not the type of futurists that try to project what might be and do scenario planning with every iota of possibility. We are very much grounded in the present as well. And so it's a matter of, as you said, peripherally looking at things that already exist, piecing it together and looking at maybe some intended, unintended consequences and opportunities so we can envision a little differently. So we're also sort of these practical futurists in addition to being rational optimists. So I know I'm amongst friends on this call, but there's a wider audience out there as well. Yeah, I mean, I've really concluded, and I don't know if you agree with this, but that sort of grand plans and strategies just don't work anymore. The world is far too unpredictable. And so this is why the kind of philosophy, push what moves, kind of resonates with me because it's very hard to plan more than one step in advance. Well, we love
to do that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, we love the fact that you've got permission to tell 3 really exciting stories, and I would love to hear the Lego story.
Yeah, so let me just, I could talk all day about these things. I know we don't have all day, but so I've had the privilege to work with Lego over the last decade, and their kind of reinvention from nearly going bankrupt probably 15 years ago now to having 10 years double-digit growth and phenomenal success, now the world's most favorite toy company, incredibly successful. It's partly down to externally generated ideas from fans and customers, initially inadvertently successful. So it wasn't strategic, they were accidents. If you look at products like Lego Mindstorms and Lego Architecture, there's an interesting history to those, which I don't have time to tell, but these were not kind of strategic moves by Lego. These were things that happened almost in spite of Lego trying to squash them many times. But because of that, they launched, and we worked with them on this, an ideas community, or helped them to pilot that and prototype that, which is now, long since our involvement, grown to about 1 million customers posting ideas for Lego products. If you get 10,000 people to support your idea, it goes into a review process, and if you pass that then they ship products like the ones you can see on the screen, and they share 1% of the revenue of those products with the creators. And every single one of these products is sold out, as far as I'm aware. And it gives Lego tons of data, which they wouldn't otherwise have had about the customer base. And it creates products like these two, Minecraft and famous female scientists embodied through Lego, which would never have come about through the internal kind of creative brilliance of the employees. So this is a model which I think is replicable far beyond the toy sector and the manufacturing sector, and one that I'm very proud to have played a very small role in helping to create.
So I'll jump in with one quick question, follow-up question. Once again, this could be probably a webinar in and of itself, and the book Brickbybrick, which I think has a different name in Danish, you know, and that incredible story of Lego that almost destroyed itself because it didn't have innovation, then almost destroyed itself because it had too much chaos in it, and then figured out a really great approach to that. So which of the steps would you say was most responsible in terms of, was it their imagination, their outreach to a larger, you know, outside of the four walls, the inspiration? You know, what was the single ingredient that you think was underscored in here in this example?
Well, the two eyes that you talked about with Denise that I thought were particularly relevant here is kind of inside now and inspire next. So getting great ideas that, you know, people would never have thought about is definitely what this community is all about. And it's also, just unleashing the creativity of your fans in this case. And creating a systematic process, the implementation eye for that creativity to come in. One of the reasons why they rejected Mindstorms and architecture that I referenced previously is because they were so overwhelmed with all different ideas. They had no mechanism to engage with that external inspiration. So the Lego Ideas platform was very kind of a systematic way to get ideas, had to meet quite a high minimum threshold of 10,000 supporters, and then go into a kind of formal review process. So by systematizing that, it really helped them to suck in that external opportunity, but also share the rewards of that through this 1% revenue share.
Great. So now let's jump on, because I already sort of gave the spoiler alert as far as mobility earlier in the conversation. Tell us the story that you'd like to tell that you that we're excited you have permission to tell about Ford.
Well, so this is all in the public domain and the URL's on the screen, but I've done a lot of work with Ford over the last 3 years, and like many other automotive companies, they are realizing that in the future, they're unlikely to be selling too many cars and much more likely to be selling mobility as a service. But as our world urbanizes, they also realize that most journeys will be multimodal, and Ford won't necessarily control every step along that way. And the types of organizations that probably will control some of the other steps are cities. And so Ford, through this program, City of Tomorrow Challenge, which has just recently been rebranded as City One, by the way, if anyone's looking for it, is a way, it's an innovation competition looking for great ideas all around the world for mobility in 5 US cities so far: Detroit, New York, Miami, Pittsburgh, and Grand Rapids, soon to be rolling out in other cities as well, and not just in America. But it's also a way that Ford can build relationships with a key stakeholder in their kind of future landscape, which are cities and city governments and citizens of cities as well, who up until now, they've not really had to have that kind of strategic relationship. So I think it's, to go back to the eyes that you talked about, it's kind of integrating forces between the commercial imperatives of a company like Ford and the kind of the social and other imperatives of a kind of city government, like, you know, the mayor of Pittsburgh, for instance, and integrating the kind of social and commercial to tackle, you know, a big innovation opportunity around the future of mobility. And this whole sector is moving so fast right now. It's very exciting. It's hard to keep up, but it's a good example, I think, of a company who is trying to get to next and working in a different way and with a different set of stakeholders.
Well, at the risk of having people think that I work for the mayor of Pittsburgh, I just met him for the very first time yesterday in conjunction with a conference where I'm speaking at Carnegie, that also had people from Carnegie Mellon talking about how the technology and the capabilities of a region can really bring talent and become a hub for interaction and collaboration. So I really like what you're saying, because it sounds like what Ford's doing is reaching out to some nodes that haven't necessarily heard from before in a way that's very different. I mean, the notion of connecting with cities literally and reaching out, it sounds like they're building a new ecosystem. And certainly earlier in the conversation, there was a question around understanding emerging unmet needs but from customers. If a car company asks you, what do you think of mobility? That's very different from people within a city already acting a certain way. And you get to sort of almost be eavesdropping in on, peering into the reality versus, a filtered view of the customer requirements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why sort of ethnographic research was a big part of that, to observe people's travel patterns, not just what they were reporting or the data that the city was collecting. So I'm very happy to talk about that separately.
Yeah, as I said, to us, the proof is in these examples. So we would love for you to share the third one and relate it to what you think the good takeaways are.
Sure. So the final example is UBS, the world's largest wealth manager and investment bank and asset manager, headquartered in Zurich, but based all around the world, and 150-year-old company, but traditionally very kind of secretive and closed, and realized a few years ago that there's all this innovation happening in the financial services sector, sometimes called fintech, or kind of associated kind of trends and buzzwords. UBS realized that they're not going to be around for another 15 years, let alone another 150, if they don't engage with some of this innovation outside their organization. So we worked with them to launch a global startup competition. We ended up having 2,500 companies from 52 different countries participating. First started in 2015 and now planning the current year's challenges. And it's really a two-way knowledge sharing opportunity kind of growing process, traditional kind of startup competition from a kind of brand point of view, but done at a very high kind of quality. And it's led to date 21 joint ventures between UBS and some small but fast growing kind of startup companies that have some really interesting ideas and technologies in machine learning and blockchain and some of the kind of trends which frankly, the expertise and the technology is often much better outside than it is inside. So I think this is another example of integrating forces between large and small. So I just thought I'd share that from a different sector as an example of an organization that is doing this well, in my view, and one that I've had the opportunity to work on.
I think these are great models. And I'm very upset that we don't have enough time to hear 15 minutes more on each of them, but certainly good provocation for the next level of conversation where
Sure.
Shawn and Denise are going to talk a little bit about, so first of all, Roland, thank you, because I think that these are universal lessons. They're inspirational. They have, when we talk about innovation you can take to the bank, these are three large brands that have taken this to the bank. And I also think that they all reflect a new model for reaching out outside of the four walls, not just with these innovation challenges, but some of the subtleties and the nuances that you talk about in terms of insights that lead to other insights and ethnography that leads to another kind of quantitative research and kind of a pretty holistic way of looking at this. So, we'll put a pin on it and have another conversation in the future. Let me turn it over to Shawn and Denise for a little bit of a coda in terms of what this all means with culture, and then Shawn and I will wrap up. And there's another poll that we're putting up on the screen as well.
Yeah, I think we love listening to the people that actually come into our webinars. We've actually listened to articulate the next 2 or 3 webinars. So I think there's a poll question there as myself and Denise talk. Hopefully you can just answer, and I will not push whatever pet one that I would want to do as a webinar in the future. So
don't do that, Shawn.
No, completely unbiased. More importantly now, though, I do want to talk to Denise. She has written the seminal book about the fit between culture and brand. And having read it and having looked at various quotes, my initial instinct was, thank God there's somebody out there in the world at large that thinks like me. Oh, my Lord. Brand is more than just pretty pictures and a logo and whatever. But and I ran across this this quote that you had about culture building being a powerful antidote to the unprecedented threats most organizations face today, which I think may be a bridge between what myself and Andrea are doing and what Roland's talked about and what you've kind of studied for the last, I don't know, decade, but certainly in the last couple of years with your book. So maybe dimensionalize what you were trying to get at when you came up with that quote.
Yeah, well, I was referring primarily to the state of business today, where we have a widespread lack of employee engagement. I think the most recent numbers from Gallup show that it's like probably close to 80% of employees are not engaged. We also have the widespread accusations of sexual discrimination and harassment. And, and also I think companies are struggling to integrate diversity and inclusion into their cultures. And so in order to address these things, leaders need to understand that culture building is a strategic leadership responsibility. And what my book Fusion, How Integrating the Brand and Culture Powers the World's Greatest Companies, talks about how it takes people through the specific steps you can take to build your culture. Yeah, I think the flip side to that quote is that culture can be the fuel for driving success, particularly in the area of innovation. But again, you need to understand that a culture of innovation is not just going to happen in your organization. You need to build in specific practices, specific processes, even specific organizational design. I'll talk about two examples. The first comes from Hootsuite, the social media management platform that a lot of people use to manage their Twitter accounts. They are
Canadian, Denise. I just got to throw that in there as a Canadian.
Oh yes, so I'll talk about them, they are their whole mission is about the customer solutions and customer experience, and so they really try to develop this organization-wide customer skill set and mindset around the customer experience. One way they do this, a very simple practice, is they have a unique peer mentoring program. So within the organization, two people are paired, not only so they can kind of share career advice and learn from each other, but they're also, each pair is assigned a customer problem. And after 3 months, the pairs are invited to present their solutions to senior management, and the most productive or the most successful solutions are then implemented. And I thought that was just a great way of democratizing innovation throughout the organization. So rather than saying, here's a department that's specifically responsible for this, getting everyone involved, getting everyone thinking about the customer and what are customer problems and therefore what are solutions. So that's an example of how you build culture just by a simple program like a peer mentoring program. Another example comes from IBM. They have a workforce, I can't remember, it's in the hundreds of thousands, and they need to upskill that workforce, particularly for all the digital transformation as well as the shift to customer experience that is happening. And so they've really cultivated this culture of education to fuel the innovations that the company needs to have. And they've taken a very interesting approach to their education platform. It's almost like a Netflix type program. So it's mostly digital, and it's mostly kind of like recommendation or AI driven in terms of the courses that you take and where you're led to direct your focus. And then you get points and prizes and ultimately badges, professional badges that you as an employee can use it in your professional career, whether you stay at IBM or not. Again, another way to think about how do you actually build your culture? How do you actually use programs and strategies specifically to cultivate this innovation mindset or this innovation capability that your company needs to have?
You know what I love about both those examples that you just shared, Denise? One is they've institutionalized it as a company, so it's just not like, let's do this for a week. No, this is a 52-week program. And I find the other really interesting thing that shining in your two examples was, I think you used the word democratized. Like I oftentimes find in poor performing innovation companies, innovation gets done by those people over there. We don't know those people, and a lot of times we might not even like those people. In these two examples, I find it's interesting how this has become a shared experiment together, right?
Right, and it really needs to be. If you go back to what you talked about, where very few companies are innovating at the business model or customer experience level, if you want to innovate at that level, everyone in your organization needs to be involved in that. You're not going to be able to disrupt your industry if only a designated team within your organization is working on it.
And maybe that's a good segue to this slide, just because I know myself and Andrea love ostrich heads in sand. So we we've now personalized it to management. But if you're a leader on this stuff, is there some cognitive dissonance between here's what I think I am and benchmarking on myself versus what my frontline troops and my, most of my staff think? Because certainly this would point to the fact that there is some kind of schism between what leadership thinks they're doing versus what the real world might.
Yeah, I've seen I love this slide, and unfortunately, I love this statistic. I've seen several others like this in culture building in general, where senior executives feel like they are building culture and they're making it a priority, but very few of their employees agree. And I think that just shows that leaders need to be very deliberate about what their desired culture is, and then to use your word, institutionalizing specific ways to get to that culture. Again, culture is not just going to happen. You need to deliberately cultivate it.
I love it. I know time and time again, we do all the stuff on transformation and digital, whatever, and it always comes back to culture and people. Like it really does. So congrats on seeing it maybe a little bit before all of us. I'm going to now throw back to Andrea. I know we're gonna all be involved in questions later, but I think you've got like a wrap up part. We're going to talk about different opportunities. So
I have one rule of thumb, and then I'm going to throw it back to Shawn, and then we're going to have Q&A. And we always like to announce that, just like in any program, our official program, our feelings are not hurt when you can't stay for the Q&A, because clearly we'll give you an opportunity to reach out to us afterwards. So we'll do sort of the next few minutes, we'll do a kind of formal wrap, and then we'll have Q&A for 10, 15 minutes, as long as people want to stay and ask us questions. And we already have 4 or 5 questions that have been fed to us. I'll do my wrap really quickly because everyone will get this deck. I think after hearing Roland, after hearing Denise, and after hearing the innovation stats from the field, that the one thing I would say for today is that if we're still benchmarking in traditional ways, we are definitely going to be left behind. And a lot of the disciplines that have served us well, like that, benchmarking against peers, for instance, completely blindside us, to use the term that was talked about earlier, from emerging ways of doing business from other industries, as well as give us false metrics. So we're measuring ourselves. I hate to use this word suck, but I have to because it's a quote. But one of the insurance companies I was with yesterday at this conference said, we don't want to just suck less than other insurance companies in this particular thing. We want to be as good as best of breed in other industries. And so I would say one thing is stop benchmarking and start looking, as Roland said and as Denise said, at other great examples. We call them next practices, not best practices. So back to you, Shawn, and we have some thoughts about what the next webinar is, and that's still an open poll. So Shawn, do you want to give us the announcements, and then we'll open up the Q&A?
Yeah, and just the quickie, I guess, people really want to hear about the business models of the future. So we're actually considering doing almost like a card deck of 52. Like we got close to about 52 business models. So we may certainly in the future end up doing a webinar specifically on business models, because I think people are almost, when they hear innovation, a lot of what they're hearing right now is business models, which is interesting and I think a good development. All right, so I'm going to go through a bit of staccato kind of announcements here. We did listen to everybody on our last webinar that we did, and so we've lined up our next 3 webinars. I love the gravitas that Roland and Denise brought to the table in this discussion. It's going to be a very high benchmark for whoever joins us in the future. We are going to have a blood sport debate between agile, lean, and design thinking on May 21st. So I'm going to wear a referee outfit, and we're going to have 3 proponents of each do their best to figure out which one may be the best for you. I think there'll be learning for all. We have a corporate innovation playbook study that I will talk about shortly, but we will be exploring all the different findings. We've gone out and explored 50 different questions, and so we're going to be doing that. And then I think the one in July, we're going to have experts in 6 different continents around the world talk to us about their lens on innovation. I'll be really interested in terms of lenses in Africa and Asia, which I don't tend to get to as frequently, to see what's going on. So there are the links. I implore you, and we've actually sweetened the pot on this one. We've got 2 different surveys that are out right now on corporate innovation. We've called it the Corporate Innovation Playbook. And there's a chance to win 8 really good books from some of our colleagues and friends. These are some of our favorites. Andrew, I think you've read all of them. I've read 3 of them, I think. So I've got some reading to do. You're more fastidious in doing your bedside table reading. I'm kind of more of a magazine guy. But so please answer the surveys. You get a chance to get a free top line report of our study, and also some of these great, amazing books. Something to be known, my hope is I'm going to ask them publicly today, but hopefully Denise and Roland will be joining us on our Global Futureproofing Guild. Hopefully by the end of the summer, we will have 50 amazing, amazing people that are truly collaborating together on different ventures and reports and things that we all consider important and interesting. So my hope is the tacit invite is out there right now, guys. I mentioned their surveys, and we're also setting up all of our different channels of Futureproofing Next online. And so stay with us shortly on that. Just a summary in terms of what we are doing. What is Futureproofing Next? And we've landed on the tagline, innovation you can take to the bank. Certainly I've heard from a number of you saying, yes, there's an element of innovation that isn't happening out there. And based on this webinar alone, we looked at what are the top criteria that clients are looking for from their innovation partners. Developing some industry thought leadership, which I think these webinars do, is one of the biggest things that we can help in terms of the community. And then next one, just once again, a reminder, we will probably be coming out with some type of innovation report in June that is kind of a distillation of what we've heard. We've got a list of different keynotes that we've actually wrapped around all of our stuff. And then certainly the playbook and our business models will be a big part of the future. So I'm glad kind of the people online today thought business models was interesting. And if you want to get in touch with us, hello@futureproofingnext.com is probably the best way to do it. I promise our website will be up before our next webinar. There's a lot of stuff to think about. And with no further ado, we should probably open it up for questions. And I know we've got a bank of them already. So to sweeten it, I'm not too sure if you have any of those at your access either. I'm
going to start with a couple, and then Sean, if you don't mind monitoring the chat, that'll be helpful.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with asking Roland a question. It was a great question that was asked by someone on the webinar. How do you avoid going around threatening people? Innovate or die.
Yeah. So I guess the question is about employees rather than kind of.
Yeah, I don't think it's customers. Yeah, I think it's customers. I think that the question to interpret it is, you know, there's this feeling that that well, we've put it on our front burner to innovate and, wag the finger, innovate or die, or, and yet clearly one of the things that's important is to keep the business running at the same time. So you don't want to feel like, well, I thought I had this other job of like keeping quarterly earnings. So, how do you deal with that emotional moment?
So, I certainly wouldn't express it as innovate or die, because that sounds, like a threat. I think innovation has to be something that people want to do. They feel kind of passionate about it, and it needs to be made easy for them. So I think the best thing that you can do is to ask interesting questions and give people the space and the incentive and the time, frankly, to then pursue whatever those ideas may be. So I don't think you can mandate innovation in that way. I do think, however, that innovation is everybody's job. I don't think it's just the responsibility of that innovation team or, a handful of kind of creative people or entrepreneurial people in the organization. I think good ideas can come from anywhere. And so it's just about making it easy for people to contribute in that way.
Great. Sean, do you want to do one for the lightning round? And these are our short answers, obviously.
Well, I know from, I saw a question from somebody online. Maybe I'll direct this one to Denise, because it does have a culture bent to it. They talked about young entrepreneurs, and I think maybe in this case, entrepreneurs as well. There may be a different expectation out there. You're 25 years old, you've just joined the company, and you may have a different lens in terms of corporate innovation. Any thoughts in terms of what they might be thinking, and then ways to cope with maybe the difference between how the real corporate world works?
Yeah, I find that the most effective business people, regardless of role, regardless of level, are effective influencers, meaning that they are able to influence the thinking and actions of others, even if they don't have a direct reporting relationship or some sort of established, pre-established working relationship. And so I think that when you come into an organization, even though you might be very new, even though you might be very young, your job is to evangelize your point of view, and to I think a lot of times that not only means helping people understand kind of what a vision might be, but then walking people through specific steps how to get there. I think that oftentimes the most effective influencers are the ones who enable. They don't just inspire, but they actually equip and take people through the process. So I would just encourage you that start small. You have to I think have a proven track record to build on, but definitely don't limit yourself to only working in your specific domain or in your specific established responsibility, but think about how can you influence the culture in general.
Man, where were you in school when I was 23, and thinking, oh, I'll just do a good job and people will notice? No, you have to get out there and build your relationship capital, right?
Right. And again, I mean, innovation requires you to have all this cross-functional collaboration and to draw out insights from all different areas. And so if you are leading that way, you can do that in any role.
So I have one last
question.
Oh, I was going to say one last question, and then I'll throw it to you, Shawn, to wrap. I'll throw it to Roland. People are looking in the chat. The questions are around getting real about this, and people who are resistant. And we talked about leadership and commitment. I was wondering if you might relate that to UBS, Lego, and Ford, where you actually saw leaders get from resistance to commitment. Is there any specific, without naming names, any specific journey that you've seen a leader just go from, no, this isn't going to work, I don't think so, to actually getting on board and having that light bulb go off?
I've certainly seen, and I'm not talking about Lego, UBS, and Ford here, many senior leaders saying innovation is a top strategic priority, but then either in the next sentence or buried in somewhere the strategy document, it's clear that the appetite for risk is very, very low. So a lot of people say they want innovation, but don't really mean it. I think in the case actually of the 3 case studies, and it's part of the reason I choose them, is because all 3 of those, I've seen real leadership demonstrated at the very top of their organization. So Bill Ford, the great grandson of Henry Ford, now the chairman of Ford Motor Company, standing up at TED and other places and internal forums saying, mobility is a basic human right. We're going to tackle climate change, bringing the kind of social mission as well as the commercial mission, which, is not always that popular on Wall Street, but, he's demonstrating leadership, and that flows through to things like the City of Tomorrow program that I talked about. Likewise, Sergio Amotti, who's the chief executive of UBS, likewise making similar bold statements around engaging with new emerging kind of startups in the financial services space, and he appointed a very kind of pioneering CIO called Oliver Bussman, who kind of drove that strategy through the organization for a number of years. He's now moved on to pastures new. So the reason I chose, and Lego the same. But they're the exception that proved the rule in many ways. I think a lot of people say they want innovation, but don't really mean it. And that is a challenge for people like us. That's part, that a lot of what we're trying to do here is overcome organizational antibodies. Yeah. That kind of resistance to change, which, is there for very good reasons. But if you don't, it is innovate or die, to use your phrase.
Well, I'll do a quick wrap. Thank you, first of all, to Roland, Denise. It was really great to have these real world, different lenses, different places in the world examples. And I'm going to throw it to Shawn to wrap us up in a second here. But I feel like the interaction from the group, and also from the webinar participants, I'm starting to feel this real sense of community. And we are here through Futureproofing Next to start tackling these and sharing what we call it next practices, so that we can all get smarter faster. And Shawn, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, once again, thank you, Denise. Thank you, Roland. Certainly, you've elevated the conversation about innovation. It's an important one to be had, and I love what we're doing here in terms of bringing, different facets to the discussion. So I really want to thank you today. Get in touch with us at hello@futureproofingnext.com if you have any thoughts or questions. I know we're going to be posting this video both online and social channels. I think anybody that was a participant in today's call will be getting an email with a summarized video of this as well. And as mentioned earlier, we have a global survey that we're doing. We'd love for you to be part of it. Certainly there's a lot of foresight and insight that we'll be sharing from it. Come back to futureproofingnext.com. We're going to tell you everything that we're planning about in the future. And the real specific thing for people in the call today is we are looking for 50 really intellectually curious, wonderfully innovative, and hopefully collaborative people from around the world to be part of our tribe of innovators, and we'll see where it goes together. So with that, the webinar, our second webinar, is now over. Please come back on, I believe it's May 21st for our next one, and thank you again for joining us today.